He said 7 words. 7 words. And for 500 years, the entire Christian world split in half over the meaning of one of them. The phrase is so familiar that most people stopped hearing it a long time ago. This is my body. 4 words in English. 4 words that triggered the Reformation, the Council of Trent, centuries of war, and a theological debate that has still not been resolved. But here is the part that nobody talks about. Jesus did not say those words in English. He said them in Aramaic. And in Aramaic, the language he spoke every day of his life, the sentence does not look like that. Because in Aramaic, there is no word for is. Not missing. Not lost in translation. Not hidden in a footnote. The copula, the verb to be, does not exist in Aramaic as a standalone word. When you say this is bread in Aramaic, you say this, bread. 2 words, no verb, the word that started the Reformation, the word that Henry VIII used to justify breaking from Rome, the word that Thomas Cranmer died for, the word debated at Marburg in 1529, when Luther and Zwingli could not agree and walked out of the same room never to meet again. That word was added by Greek translators, centuries after Jesus spoke. So the question is not what is means. The question is, what was Jesus actually saying that night? Because when you go back to the room, the actual meal, the actual words in the actual language, something completely different emerges, something that is not about a debate over substance, something that is far older, far deeper, and far more specific. Tonight we go to the upper room, we go to the table, we go to the Aramaic, and we find the word that Jesus did use, the word that was not lost, the word that has been sitting in the Greek text for 2,000 years, largely ignored, because it does not translate well into English. A word that does not mean memory, a word that means presence. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand what kind of night it was. It was Passover. And in first century Jerusalem, Passover was not a quiet religious holiday. It was the most volatile week of the Roman calendar. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, records that during Passover, the population of Jerusalem swelled from roughly 40,000 residents to somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million pilgrims. His own estimate was 2.5 million, though modern historians consider that figure exaggerated. Even conservative estimates suggest the city tripled or quadrupled in size. Every road into Jerusalem was packed. Every inn was full. Every available rooftop had someone sleeping on it. The Romans knew this. Every year for Passover, the Roman governor, that year, Pontius Pilate, left his residence in Caesarea Maritima and traveled to Jerusalem. Not out of religious interest, out of military caution. He brought additional troops. He positioned soldiers on the porticos of the Temple Mount, overlooking the crowd. He was watching for exactly the kind of trouble that would erupt if a Galilean rabbi with a growing following decided to do something provocative during the most charged week of the Jewish year. And Jesus had already done something provocative. Days earlier, he had entered Jerusalem on a donkey, a deliberate echo of the messianic prophecy in Zechariah. He had walked into the temple and overturned the money changers' tables. He had been publicly debating the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the temple courts for 3 days. He was not hiding. So when the disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover?" that was not a casual question. That was a security question. Who knew where they would be? Who could be trusted? The answer Jesus gave was strange. He said, "Go into the city, and you will find a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him." That detail is specific and intentional. In 1st century Jerusalem, men did not carry water jars. That was women's work. A man carrying a water jar in the streets of Jerusalem would have been immediately visible, an unusual enough sight to follow without mistake. Some historians believe this was a pre-arranged signal, a contact Jesus had organized in advance without telling the disciples, precisely so that no one could betray the location beforehand. The room they found was on the southwestern hill of Jerusalem, the area known today as Mount Zion. It was an upper room, a furnished room already prepared. The Greek word used is katalima, a guest room, a lodging space. This was not a public inn. This was a private home. The 12 disciples were there, and so was Jesus. And the meal they were about to eat had a very specific structure, a structure every one of them had followed every year since childhood, a structure that Jesus was about to deliberately break. The site that tradition identifies as that upper room still exists. It is called the Cenacle. It sits on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, roughly 400 meters southwest of the Temple Mount. The current structure is a Crusader-era building from the 12th century, rebuilt over Byzantine foundations, rebuilt over earlier foundations. It has been a church, a mosque, a synagogue, and a place of pilgrimage for every branch of Christianity since at least the 4th century. Archaeological and textual evidence for the site's antiquity comes from multiple directions. Egeria, a 4th century pilgrim from Spain, describes visiting the upper church of Sion, where the Last Supper took place. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing around 332 AD, records that a small church on Mount Zion survived the destruction of Jerusalem by Hadrian in 135 AD. The Jerusalem Talmud refers to a synagogue church in this area that was still functioning after the Roman destruction. The convergence of these sources suggests the location was identified early and continuously. What we know about the room itself is informed by what we know about how Passover meals were held in 1st century Jerusalem. The Mishnah, the rabbinic legal compilation that, while written down in the 2nd century, preserved oral traditions from the Temple period, describes the Seder in detail. The meal was to be eaten reclining, not sitting upright, reclining on the left side in the Roman triclinium posture, a sign of freedom and rest, because a free person reclines and a slave does not. This is why the Gospel of John describes the disciple whom Jesus loved as reclining at his bosom, leaning back against Jesus' chest. In a triclinium arrangement, the guest to the right of the host reclined in front of the host, close enough to lean back. The disciple's position next to Jesus was not just sentimental, it was a position of honor. The Passover Seder in the 1st century had a structure built around 4 cups of wine. Each cup corresponded to one of the 4 promises God made to Israel in Exodus chapter 6. I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my people. The first cup opened the Seder. The second followed the recitation of the Passover story, the Haggadah. The third cup came after the meal. The fourth cup closed the evening, following the singing of the Hallel, Psalms 113 through 118. We know from the Synoptic Gospels that Jesus and the disciples sang a hymn before going to the Garden of Gethsemane. The word used is hymnesis. They sang a hymn. In the context of a Passover Seder, that hymn would almost certainly have been the second part of the Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118. These were the psalms that ended every Passover meal. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, describes the Passover sacrifice at the temple in meticulous detail. In the years before the temple's destruction, he writes that the priests slaughtered the Passover lambs in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, while the Levites sang the Hallel. The blood was collected in basins and thrown against the base of the altar. Then the lambs were taken to wherever the families were lodging to be roasted and eaten that night. That lamb would have been at the center of the table in that upper room. And what Jesus did with that lamb, specifically what he did not do, is one of the most overlooked details in the entire New Testament. but that is only the first layer. The structure of the meal matters, but the words matter more. And when you read the words in the language they were spoken, not in the language they were translated into, the entire scene shifts. Let us go back to the words. The accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the same sequence. Jesus took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body." He took a cup of wine and said, "This is my blood of the covenant." In the Gospel of Luke and in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he adds a phrase, "Do this in remembrance of me." That phrase, "in remembrance of me," contains the word that has been sitting in the Greek text for 2,000 years, waiting. The Greek word is anamnesis. Anamnesis. It is translated in almost every English Bible as remembrance. But that translation, while not wrong, strips out almost everything that makes the word significant. In classical Greek, anamnesis does not simply mean to remember something from the past. It means to make something from the past present again, to bring it into the current moment so that it is no longer past. Plato used the word in the context of his theory of knowledge, that learning is not acquiring new information, but anamnesis, the recollection of truths the soul already knows from before birth. The past is not recalled. The past is made present, but the word becomes even more specific when you trace it back to the Hebrew and Aramaic world that Jesus inhabited. The Hebrew equivalent is zikaron, a word used in Exodus chapter 12. And in the Hebrew Bible, zikaron is not a passive act of memory. It is active. It is performative. When God says in Exodus chapter 12, "This day shall be a zikaron for you," referring to the Passover, He does not mean you will think fondly of this event. He means every time you do this, this event becomes present. You are not remembering the Exodus. You are participating in it. This is why the Passover Haggadah, which existed in oral form in Jesus' day, instructs every participant to say, in every generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally left Egypt, not as if their ancestors left Egypt, as if they, the person at the table, tonight, left Egypt. The Seder is not a memorial, it is a time machine. That is the world Jesus was speaking from when he said, "Do this as my anamnesis." He was not saying, "Remember me when I'm gone." He was using the technical vocabulary of Passover reenactment. He was saying, "Every time you do this, I am here." Not remembered, present. And now, the word that was never there. "This is my body." Jesus spoke Aramaic. The word for body in Aramaic is gufa. The word for this is ha. What Jesus said in his own language was something like, "Ha, gufa di." This, my body. No verb, no is. In Aramaic, you do not need one. When the Gospel writers, writing in Greek, translated this phrase, they inserted the Greek word estin, is. They had to. Greek requires a verb, so they added one, faithfully, accurately, by the grammatical rules of their language. And for 500 years, that added word became the center of the most consequential debate in Western Christianity. At the Diet of Marburg in 1529, Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli met to try to unify the Protestant movement. They agreed on 14 out of 15 articles. The one article they could not resolve was this: what does "is" mean in "this is my body"? Does the bread actually become the body? Is the body present alongside the bread? Or is it purely symbolic? Luther reportedly wrote "Hoc est corpus meum" on the table in chalk and refused to move from it. Zwingli argued it was metaphor. They never agreed. They never met again. The entire split, the split that created two distinct streams of Protestantism that persist to this day, was a debate about a word that was not in the original. But here is where it gets extraordinary, because the real question was never what "is" means. The real question is what anamnesis means. And if anamnesis means not memory, but presence, then the question of whether the bread is, or represents, or contains the body dissolves into a different question entirely. Not what is happening to the bread, but who is at this table. If you have never heard this before, subscribe. This channel goes to the original languages every single time. It costs you nothing. It changes everything. Go back to the table. Go back to the structure of the meal. The Passover Seder had a lamb at its center, not symbolic, not metaphorical. An actual roasted lamb, sacrificed that afternoon at the temple, carried back to the lodging, eaten at the table. The lamb was the axis of the entire meal. It was the reason for every ritual that surrounded it. Now watch what Jesus does. The 4 cups of wine mark the 4 stages of the Seder. The 3rd cup, the one drunk after the meal, after the lamb has been eaten, was called in rabbinic tradition the cup of redemption. It was associated specifically with the promise in Exodus chapter 6, "I will redeem you with an outstretched arm." It was the cup of blood, the cup that pointed back to the blood on the doorposts in Egypt, the blood that caused the angel of death to pass over. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians chapter 11, writes, "In the same way, after supper, he took the cup." After supper, after the meal. That timing is precise. It places the cup Jesus identified as the new covenant in my blood. At exactly the 3rd cup, the cup of redemption, Jesus took the cup of redemption and changed its referent. Not the blood of the Passover lamb in Egypt, but my blood, here, tonight. And then he said something that is so striking that most people read right past it. He said, "I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Matthew chapter 26, verse 29. He stopped the Seder at the 3rd cup. In every Passover Seder, there is a 4th cup, the cup of praise, the cup that closes the evening, following the final Hallel Psalms. Jesus said, "I am not drinking the 4th cup, not tonight." This was not a casual omission. In the 1st century, an incomplete Seder was significant. The 4th cup was the cup of fulfillment, the cup of "I will take you as my people." Leaving it undrunk was leaving a promise open, a covenant unfinished. Jesus left the 4th cup on the table. He went to Gethsemane. He was arrested. He was crucified. And on the cross in the Gospel of John chapter 19, when the soldiers offered him wine vinegar on a sponge, Jesus received it. And the text says, when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The Greek word translated, "it is finished," is tetelestai. It means completed, brought to its proper end, a debt paid in full. Some New Testament scholars have argued that this final cup on the cross was the 4th cup, the cup Jesus declined to drink at the Seder, the cup of fulfillment, completed not at a table in an upper room in Jerusalem, but on a cross outside the city walls. Whether or not one accepts that specific interpretation, the structure is undeniable. Jesus used the Passover deliberately. He placed himself at the center of it, not as the one conducting the Seder, but as the element the Seder was pointing to. The lamb had always been the point, and then at Passover, Jesus became the point. We started with a question. What did Jesus really say that night? Not in the Sunday school version, not in the debate between Luther and Zwingli, not in the theological language that accumulated over 20 centuries of church councils and confessions and reformations. What did he actually say in that room, in that language, at that table? He said, "The Passover you have celebrated every year since you were children. The meal about Egypt, about slavery, about blood on doorposts. It was always pointing somewhere. You have been performing a zikaron, a reenactment, a making present of the night God passed over you. Tonight that changes. From now on, when you do this, you will not be making Egypt present. You will be making this night present. Me here, at this table, with you. He took the cup of redemption and said, "This is about my blood now." He declined the fourth cup and said, "I will finish this later." And then he walked out into the night. The most important meal in human history, at least for the 2 billion people who today call themselves Christians, did not end at the table. It ended on a cross, with a cup of wine vinegar and a word that meant complete. What happens next is not a theological abstraction. It is the story of the person who sat at that table and betrayed the man who had just handed him bread. His name was Judas Iscariot, and what happened to him after that night is one of the strangest, most contradictory, and most misunderstood stories in the entire New Testament. The Gospels give 2 different accounts of his death. They cannot both be true, unless when you go back to the original languages, you find something that reconciles them in a way nobody expects. That is the next episode. If this is the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe. Every episode goes to the original languages, the archaeology, the history that does not make it into the Sunday version. Next time, Judas Iscariot. What he did after he betrayed Jesus, what the 30 pieces of silver actually bought, and why the 2 accounts of his death, which appear to directly contradict each other, are actually telling the same story in a way that took 2,000 years to see clearly. That episode is next. Do not miss it.